Right, so the Gustav Leonhardt Pedagogy Archive is an online collection of essays about Leonhardt's teaching, and it's written by his own students, of which there were well over 150. And the archive can be viewed and studied through a free access website. It's live now. It's been live for a couple of years. So Leonhardt was one of the most famous and influential leaders of the early music movement in the second half of the 20th century. He performed all over the world, possibly in Portland, I don't know if anyone knows that. Not only as a harpsichordist, as a soloist, but also as a chamber musician and as a conductor. And he made over 200 recordings and won countless awards and honorary doctorates. Before we look at Leonhardt's life a little bit in detail and talk about what this archive is all about, let's just listen a little bit to what some of Leonhardt's students said about him. Starting with Alan Curtis, who many of you may know from his many years teaching in Berkeley. He was one of Leonhardt's very first students, which was in the 1950s. And Alan Curtis became very highly respected as a conductor for his many opera recordings, as well as a teacher, of course, in Berkeley. And here's something that Alan Curtis wrote after Leonhardt's death. One of the things I heard him play was an unmeasured prelude, and I remember feeling that every note was placed with exactly the most appropriate split-second timing. I feel that timing, in the sense of when exactly you play a note and when you release it, in a context of rhythmic nuance, is more important on the harpsichord than on any other instrument. And that Leonhardt is the person who first made us all aware of this fact, and who was able, better than anyone I have ever heard, to demonstrate it. Here are a couple of other Leonhardt students. Gregory Crowell only attended a single master class with Leonhardt in 1991 at Oberlin. But that master class had a big effect on him, and he kept his notes. And he wrote up his notes for the archive. And one of the things he wrote is, though the passage had already been played well by the student, Leonhardt's rendition not only transformed the music, but the sound of the harpsichord as well. There was an audible gasp from the audience the second he began to play. Another student was the late Linda Berman Hall, who lived in California. She wrote, Leonhardt's interpretation seemed to pull motives apart just enough to let the light of cosmic reason shine down to illuminate the heart of the music. His phrases breathe and animate. His progressions have an imperative logic that we miss in the playing of lesser interpreters. So let's have a look at Leonhardt's life just briefly. He was born in 1928 in a family of wealthy music lovers. His father, George, was on the board of the Nederlands Bachvereniging. Now that was the Dutch Bach Society, and they have performed Bach's Passions, the St. Matthew Passion and the John Passion, annually since 1921, just over a century. And they were an incredibly influential organization. They invited Wanda Landowska and Albert Schweitzer to come to Holland. And the Leonhardt House, family house, which you see here, was just a few miles from Naarden, this church where they performed and still perform every year the Bach Passions. You may know the Nederlands Bachvereniging, the Dutch Bach Society, if you know the channel on YouTube called All of Bach, which is making videos of every single piece that Bach wrote and releasing them one by one each week, which has been going for, I guess, around 10 years. There are a lot of really fine performances, and they have an immense worldwide audience. So Leonhardt attended the Schola Cantorum in Basel in Switzerland, which is even today still one of the best places, one of the best conservatories to study harpsichord. And after he finished studying, he published his dissertation, which proved that Bach's Art of Fugue is indeed a work for harpsichord. There's been a lot of controversy and discussion about what instrument or set of instruments Bach intended the artifuge for, and Leonhardt's whole thesis is that it is indeed for harpsichord, and goes into great detail about why that's true. So after he finished studying, he went to Vienna, ostensibly to study conducting, but he was not interested in his conducting course at all. But instead in Vienna, he had access to a lot of original manuscripts from the 17th and 18th century, and he spent a great deal of time copying these by hand. A lot of this music had never been published. And he met Nikolaus Harnoncourt, who was a gambist and cellist and became a very important conductor of his group, the Concertus Musicus. Leonhardt founded a chamber ensemble, not an orchestra. I think he was far more attracted to music on a small scale, and there weren't enough musicians playing Baroque instruments in the 1950s, I think, to found an orchestra. In his chamber group, his first violinist was his wife, Marie, who was a very fine musician as well. And in 1955, Leonhardt started teaching at the conservatory in Amsterdam, and his first students included several Americans, such as Alan Curtis. He was also appointed in Amsterdam to the position of organist of the Valse Kerk, that is a French-speaking Protestant congregation in the historic heart of Amsterdam. And that gave him unlimited access to a very important historic organ, the Christian Müller organ from 1733. So he would play that weekly in concerts. He would, in services. He would occasionally do concerts, and he would also teach organ students on that organ. And he turned the Valse Kerk into a concert venue, effectively, because he and his small chamber ensemble gave so many concerts, and he invited other people to give concerts, that the Valse Kerk was perhaps the best place in Europe to hear early music played on original instruments. In 1969, he spent a year at Harvard lecturing, and he had many harpsichord students in Boston. The following year, in 1970, both Leonhardt and Harnoncourt embarked on this monumental task to record all of the Bach cantatas. It's 193 cantatas on original instruments, which had never been done. So they worked separately. Harnoncourt took some of the cantatas and recorded in Vienna, and Leonhardt took the remaining cantatas and recorded them in Haarlem, which is near Amsterdam. They struggled a lot to find people that were really able to play such difficult music on original instruments. Here in the picture you see Leonhardt and Nikolaus Harnoncourt with Queen Beatrix, the former Queen of the Netherlands. Leonhardt and Harnoncourt were awarded the Erasmus Prize in 1980 for this groundbreaking cantata project. Leonhardt lived in a very important house on a canal in the center of Amsterdam, the Huis Bartolotti. It is probably the most famous and the grandest canal house. And it is still pointed out if you take a canal boat tour, although it's not pointed out because he lived there, but just because of the building and the architecture. And Leonhardt and his wife Marie furnished the house like a palace. It was full of old master paintings, antique furniture, antique glass and silver and ceramics, and of course, many instruments. There were around 10 keyboard instruments, so that's mostly harpsichords, but a couple of clavichords and 2 small chamber organs. And he decided that he would teach exclusively in his home. He would no longer go to the conservatory building, which he disliked, and he would teach harpsichord in his own home and organ in the Valse Kerk, where he was organist. And that means that his students were submerged in his aesthetic vision, which essentially excluded the modern world. When you went into his house, it was like the modern world didn't exist. Finally, in 1972, Leonhardt did conduct a Baroque orchestra with Sigiswald Kaukin, the violinist, and the first recording they made was a little-known work of Lully, and it had enormous impact in the early music world. Leonhardt loved Jan Pieterszoon Sweelinck, who was an organist in Amsterdam, organist and harpsichordist, around 1600 in the Elizabethan period in England. Sweelinck was a very important organist who would improvise concerts that were very popular. He was actually paid by the city government to give improvisation concerts. And he had many, many students, many from Germany. And so people talk about this connection between Sweelinck and Bach. Bach was 100 years later. But Sweelinck's students, and then his students, were the teachers of Bach, some of the teachers of Bach. So there is a connection. So Leonhardt brought out an edition of, a scholarly edition of Sweelinck's toccatas and fantasias. One of Leonhardt's interests was the architectural heritage of Amsterdam, and he published a book on the house that he lived in, this very important canal house. And in 1981, he left the Valse-Kerk and that wonderful, although slightly small organ, for a very grand, very large 17th century organ that was newly restored in the Nieuwe Kerk, right on the Dam Square in Amsterdam. He died in 2012, a few weeks after his last concert in Paris. So he went on into his 80s, giving around 100 concerts a year. There was a memorial service which was held in the Westerkerk, very close to the Haus Bartolotti, where the Leonhardts lived. And the Westerkerk is a late Renaissance church where Rembrandt is buried. His instruments went to various students of his. They were sold to various students. But his art and antique collection was so large and so important and so valuable that it was sold at Sotheby's in auction in London. And if you Google Sotheby's and the Gustav Leonhardt collection, you will see a lot of the things that he had in his house, which is a bit mind-blowing. One of the things that Leonhardt believed was that the only real music was live performance. To him, recordings were just documents rather than artistic statements. And he once told me that he hoped all of his recordings would turn to dust after his death. And he said to a student, "A recording represents music making as poorly as a photograph represents an oil painting." So if the recordings were not important to Leonhardt, what did he believe was his lasting legacy? I think that he believed the restoration of important historic organs in the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe was very, very important. But I think that he also knew that he had transformed how the harpsichord was played and how it was listened to. And a lot of that transformation was achieved through his students. In the conservatory, he had, over a 40-year period, around 150 students, and then there were many other people who attended master classes and private lessons throughout his life. Where did the students come from? Well, this is the word cloud that shows you there was a great proportion of them were American, and a lot of them came on Fulbright scholarships. After that, of course, there were a lot of Dutch students, but there were also Japanese and British and Italian and so on. These are some of the prominent Leonhardt students. I've added some names on here in particular that are people that live or used to live on the West Coast here. Laureate Goldberg founded Music Sources in Berkeley, which is where I'm giving this program a lecture next week. Elaine Thornburg teaches at Stanford. Jolan Stoppels-Dupree in Seattle. Christopher Hogwood was a Leonhardt student. He founded the Academy of Ancient Music in London, an incredibly successful Baroque orchestra, which is still going. And he was also a really important musicologist, Christopher Hogwood. And in the Netherlands, his most well-known students are Bob van Asperen and Ton Koopman, who've had enormous careers as well. And then there are the students of the Leonhardt students, and they're very prominent as well, including on the West Coast, people like Hanneke van Prostij, who has also a very good YouTube channel, Jonathan Rhodes-Lee, Gilbert Martinez, Eugene Brzezinski, and so on. Byron Schenkman, who I think is in Seattle. But why should we study Leonhardt? Why am I giving a lecture? Why should we research Leonhardt? Okay, he was an interesting musician and so on. The early music movement itself has a musicological basis. So the assumptions behind the early music movement are that we should study surviving musical instruments from the 17th and 18th century. We should study historical written accounts of performances, which there are many, and treatises written by composers such as Frescobaldi, François Couperin, Carl Emanuel Bach, the oldest son of Bach. These treatises were didactic books about how instruments should be played, how music should be made, and so on. And that we should study these materials that survive to try to understand the music better and how it should be played. But now, the early music movement itself, which is, I guess, a phenomenon that essentially started in the 1950s, has become a subject of study too. And a lot has been published about it by musicologists, and a lot of papers are presented every year about it. And the 20th century pioneers such as Leonhardt and their work is now being explored, and people are asking questions like, why should people today even bother with studying historical performance practice? Can we ever accurately recreate a historical performance? And should we even be trying to do that? And to what degree is our interpretation of sources, historic sources, influenced by the attitudes of our own time? So when we read François Couperin's treatise on the art of playing the harpsichord, we're reading it with a 21st century brain, and those assumptions are coloring how we understand these books. And are we actually creating a new performance dogma, and is that healthy? Are we saying there's only one way to play the harpsichord, there's only one way to play the violin? Is that what we're achieving, and is that really a good thing? So a lot of those questions can be considered when looking at Leonhardt and his teaching. There's a kind of mystery and mythology about who he was and what he believed in. He never wrote a book about his musical life and what choices, musical choices he made and why, and what parameters he set himself. Therefore, the recollections of his students are probably the best way to understand Leonhardt and to help us decide whether he has something to teach us today or not. Historians would call this primary source material because these are descriptions of what happened in the past, written by the people who experienced it themselves. We're talking about the students, they went to their lesson, what was the experience of the lesson? What did the students do? What did Leonhardt do? What did they get out of it? The students in musical context can be really important. One of the key areas of research about Johann Sebastian Bach today is looking at the surviving documents written by his students. Now, I can't say that Leonhardt is Bach, although he did play the role of Johann Sebastian Bach in an avant-garde film in 1968. It is on YouTube. It has also been colorized. It is a rather strange film. About it. Anyway, if we want to understand why we do what we do with early keyboard instruments and to debate and innovate, I think we should try to understand Leonhardt as harpsichordists. So, the Pedagogy Archive was founded by myself and two other Leonhardt students, Martha Cook and Bruce Allen Brown, in 2018. We tried to contact all the surviving students of Leonhardt. Unfortunately, at least 30 of them have already passed away. We invited all of them to send us their reminiscences and their insights, and we made this open to people that were studied with Leonhardt for a year or more, but also people who only attended a single master class or had private lessons. We wanted to get as much insight as we could. And we did a crowdfunding just to fund the technical costs of our database and our website. So this is the archive. These are some of the people that have already contributed. It's been very well received in the harpsichord community. We have around 25 contributions. We're hoping to have more. And we hope to eventually turn the website and all of these contributions that people have made into an ebook which will also be available freely. So the contributors were given a questionnaire to fill in. They had questions they could answer, but they were also allowed just to write an essay in free text, whatever they wanted to do. So let's look at some of the key themes of what the students wrote. So one of the things the students talked about is what repertoire did they play? In the 1960s, a lot of the harpsichord repertoire had not really been published, had not been recorded, and simply students didn't really know what to play. So they went in to see Leonhardt, and he said, okay, next week, why don't you play this piece by Thomas Morley? And he also told them what historical treatises they should read about how to play the harpsichord. As time went on into the 70s and 80s, the students were already well prepared. In that sense, they knew a lot more about the harpsichord repertoire, and they had already looked at treatises and things like that. So he was starting at a different level. So Martin Perlman, who is a conductor in Boston, he wrote, Leonhardt had me bring in different music every week so that we covered an enormous amount of repertoire. In my words, I would say about what we played. He appreciated quality wherever it might be found, including anonymous pieces and works by little-known composers. He recorded a great deal of these, especially on the organ, and was also very generous in allowing students to make copies of music in his library. And this music was often written out in his own hand, as I mentioned he had done in the 1950s. One idiosyncrasy of Leonhardt is that he strongly disliked Handel. And I think all the students knew, don't bring Handel to a lesson. The setting of the lessons was, as I've mentioned, the Bartolotti House and the Walserkerk. Tilman Skowronek, who was another Leonhardt student, said, one would pull the old-fashioned doorbell, which was connected to some hanging bells. The door would open, and then enter the dark marble hallway, which we see here, and march to where Leonhardt stood near the stairs at the right to shake hands. Lessons took place in the large salon, located on the same floor. He seated himself quite far away from the harpsichord, almost in the corner of a room. The format of the beginning of a normal lesson then was that of a private performance. Jung-Hai Kim, who is the director of music sources in Berkeley, wrote, each lesson took place in the sacred space he created, enhanced by the setting in a historic home. I described it like this. The artistic conception of the Leonhardt's home had a powerful integrity. Somehow I not only felt that it was possible to live as in the 18th century, but then when you were inside the house and heard no exterior noise apart from the bells of the Westerkerk, the 20th century ceased to exist. Sometimes I think that Leonhardt's domestic environment had contributed to his intuitive and deeply nuanced understanding of 17th and 18th century music. He lived and breathed the period. What did Leonhardt say about technique? Not all that much. So Tilman Skowronek wrote, students were expected to already have a solid technique. What he did discuss was touch, especially precision and lightness, and a relaxed hand. Charlotte Maddox, another American harpsichordist, wrote, he did not discuss keyboard technique per se, but rather harpsichord techniques that could be used to make the instrument expressive, such as over legato, articulation, staggered releases, arpeggiation, etc. How much did Leonhardt talk about historic performance practice? That is basically what is in these historic treatises, these didactic books that survive from the 17th, 18th century. Leonhardt was not the dogmatic person some people thought that he might be. Tilman Skowronek said, Leonhardt often dodged performance practical issues with a "we don't know." The clearest example may be his attitude towards Louis Couperin's unmeasured preludes, where he simply said, we really have no idea at all how they play this kind of music. Nonetheless, we had a full lesson about that piece. Medea Bindwald, who was a German student, said, his fingerings were not always strictly historical, but consistently connected to his decisions regarding articulation and dynamics. I wrote, his own fingerings were idiosyncratic and were chosen to make the particular musical effect he wanted, rather than to be slavish to any particular historical source. And Thomas Spacht, another American student, The story goes that someone was telling Leonhardt that a certain musician had explained how a piece of music should be played. Leonhardt replied with words to this effect: "Ah yes, Mr. X has the truth, but there is no truth." What was the musical content? This was the area where he really excelled. Tilman Skowronek. I remember working for an entire hour on a one-page Froberger Allemande. The range of expressive variation he was asking for within these few notes was extraordinary. Witty was just one of the adjectives which Leonhardt used evocatively. Others included noble, sweet, regretful. And the amazing thing is that he could apply these human emotions to a whole movement or even to just a single gesture within a measure and translate these into the movement of his fingers and the sound he was creating. He had a philosophy about public performance. He was very conscious that the students were about to launch themselves onto the concert stage. He believed public performance was not the same as playing at home or in a conservatory. Charlotte Maddox wrote, he emphasized that I should captivate the audience with variety, imagination, fire and wit, and take time to enjoy the beautiful moments by letting the melody soar over long time spans. If slow, bring out the sweet harmonies, dwell on them and listen for the beautiful notes. Fast passages can be truly wild and uninhibited. Make the audience listen to each note through variety and bring out the personality of the piece. In his own home, he would play with much greater freedom, daring, and expressiveness than he would in recordings. Years later, he explained to me that he believed recordings were documents that needed to bear repeated listening, whereas in live performance, one could and should take risks and make use of the inspiration of the moment. In particular, he believed that we needed to respond to the particular qualities of the instrument we were playing on the day and the acoustic of each hall or church. Leonhardt also learned and taught from the visual arts. He was a connoisseur of the visual arts of the Renaissance and the Baroque. He was very knowledgeable about painting, drawing, sculpture, and architecture. On his coffee table, you always saw art books and auction catalogs, and he was able to make connections between the visual arts and music of the same period. Perhaps the Bartolotti house, the building itself and its contents, were an extension of his identity as a musician. Tilman Skowronek said, when I played Zweling, he asked whether I visited the Franz Hals Museum in Haarlem and looked at those healthy and rosy-cheeked people depicted by Hals. At the end of my last lesson, for which I had chosen pieces by Duflé, who is a composer from the period just before the French Revolution, he reminded me at the door that this music was like some exquisite bonbons, enticing and quite pleasing on the outside, but with a soft filling. Charlotte Maddox wrote, when I played some Zweling, he made an analogy to the Westerkerk, which was built between 1620 and 1631 in Renaissance style. The architect applied detail, that is decorative elements, to a rather more square structure. This means for Zweling, precise articulation, not much rubato or over legato, and measured trills. The teacher-student relationship was a paradox. We all felt very intimidated by Leonhardt. He was a musical genius, and he was at least initially very formal, and he came across as this very aristocratic person who lived in a palace. Imagine going in and having a lesson with someone like that. But his view of the relationship was very different. For him, lessons were a conversation between equals. Lenore Merkrosky, who taught in Texas, wrote, my sense was that he took what I was trying to do or say with a piece and worked with that. I have a wonderful memory about that very approach. It happened that another student and I were working on the same Frescobaldi toccata. We compared Leonhardt's suggestions, and they were very different. I thought, he's wanting me to say what I think. So what sums up the experience of being a Leonhardt student? Linda Berman Hall said, Leonhardt's masterful use of historical evidence about what composers expected and players did in various times and places, combined with his own willingness to take risks, and to be spontaneous has set a high standard for other players. Listening to him, I'm always reminded to return to sources, to be deeply thoughtful about the possibilities of pieces, to consider context, to experiment, to refresh, to reset everything from time to time. Now, the lessons were never filmed, and Leonhardt didn't like being filmed. He didn't like being on television, and he turned down many, many requests to do so. But there's one way we can go back and see a bit about what a Leonhardt lesson was like. If you look on YouTube, there's an interview from Dutch TV, and it's the closest thing we can get to a Leonhardt lesson. It's called A Traveler in Music. If you Google Gustav Leonhardt Traveler in Music, you'll find it. It's a very intelligent interview with an artist who hated television and very rarely accepted invitations. It talks in great deal about a few pieces in exactly the way he would in a lesson. It also contains several live performances of entire pieces, which is very rare to see and very different from what we hear on Leonhardt recordings. It's more free, it's more expressive, and you can see his hands at work, so it's well worth seeking that out. In an interview a year before Leonhardt died, he said, "The core of musical pedagogy is, from my point of view, that musicians have to learn to formulate an answer when asked the question, why?" And as we've heard from so many of his students, that answer cannot be because my teacher told me, or because I read this in an old book. That's not satisfactory. So I hope that's given you a little glimpse of why Gustav Leonhardt was an incredibly important person for the harpsichord world, and to me, I think he still is an incredibly important influence through his students and the students of students. If you have any questions, please, I'm happy to take them.
What did he find was the best way to articulate?
I think that he believed that there were infinite gradations of articulation. So everything from the very wettest sound, which is overholding notes played one after the other, all the way to the other extreme, extremely short notes. I mean, on some of the Leonhardt recordings, I listen and I think, I didn't think a note could be that short. You know, it is incredible. And every possible connection between notes, in between overholding and incredibly short. And it all depended on the context, and it depended on the meaning of the music. Understanding, okay, what is this composer telling us through this? And the articulation then comes out of that.
Well, do you know specifically if he said that you should articulate after every bar or every harmonic change, or have you ever run across like list of when he said to articulate?
He didn't like rules like that. I mean, I think that most people who are studying the harpsichord are told things like you articulate, you create some space between a strong beat, from a weak beat to a strong beat. You articulate when the melody has a leap rather than it's moving by steps and things like that. I think those are kind of basic rules that are there in the background. And I think what Leonhardt was about is saying, how do we apply those rules? What are the gradations we can make? And when can we break those rules? Because we think in this context, no, I don't want to articulate, whereas in another context, I might do so. Hello.
Yes, I have a question. Do you remember anything Leonhardt said from your very first lesson in Amsterdam, and what you may have been thinking on your way back to your flat after that lesson?
I think this is a bit of a loaded question because this is my brother. I remember more than I do. I do remember that lesson. My very first lesson was actually an organ lesson rather than a harpsichord lesson. And there's quite a lot that I remember. I think the main thing that I remembered is that it was completely different from any organ teacher that I had had previously, and I felt that the organ world was very conservative and very rules-bound, and Leonhardt's approach was much more imaginative. He also, at the end of the lesson, invited me to be his harpsichord student, for which I had to wait 3 years on his waiting list. But is there something you remember from that lesson that I told you? No? You're just curious whether I remembered it, yeah.
Yeah, just open-ended, I mean, I can imagine, but yeah, I mean, did you feel really lucky? Like you just, this is your calling and this is it? And were you like terrified or?
I was terrified, absolutely terrified. The funny thing was that I went to Europe to study the organ, and I was very young. I was only 19, and I got a bit frustrated because the organ world can be very conservative, and I felt like there wasn't a lot of imagination. And I admired Leonhardt, and I approached him and said, "Would you give me an organ lesson?" And then we had this lesson, which went on for an hour and a half. And at the end of it, I said, "Well, can I study organ with you?" And he said, "I'm not an organ professor at the conservatory. I'm a harpsichord professor." But of course, he was a very well-known organist. And then he got his pocket diary out, and he looked and he said, "Okay, in 3 years, come back and be a harpsichord student." But I didn't actually play the harpsichord. And of course, I said yes, but I spent 3 years learning how to play the harpsichord. I came back. Of course, it's terrified. I mean, the number of nightmares I had during those 3 years of what studying the harpsichord with Leonhardt was going to be like. I cannot tell you how many. And I arrived back in Amsterdam. I saw him at a concert, and I said, "Hey, I'm back." and everything. I said, "We're going to start lessons." And he said, "And you play the organ, don't you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, anytime you don't feel like a harpsichord lesson, and you want an organ lesson, then just meet me in the Valsicaire, and no one needs to know." I think officially because he wasn't appointed, and there was the politics of the conservatory. You can't teach an instrument that is not your instrument, I think, in any conservatory. And he said, "Oh, no. You want organ lessons, then just come to the church, let me know, and we'll meet there." So all of those nightmares about how am I going to play the harpsichord? Of course, I'm so glad that I did learn to play the harpsichord, and I did study with him. But it was good to have organ lessons as well. Hi, Carol.
Did he ever speak about trying to create subtle dynamic effects on the harpsichord?
Yes, he did. He talked about that a lot.
Oh.
So, of course, he talked about how to create accent and bring attention to something that should be perceived as more important and louder. But the converse of that is how to make things softer. And that was, as an instrument which the plucks are basically equal in strength, how do you make something fade a little bit into the background? That was a really important topic for him. And he was often showing hand positions that would help achieve that, use of overholding and staggered releases and all kinds of ways of trying to achieve that. It was really important to him. Hi.
I have 2 questions. One is, did all this take place in Dutch?
No. So he was a linguist, so he spoke very, very good English. He spoke good German, good French, and he could fake Italian. But he didn't speak any Japanese. So the Japanese students generally chose English. Some of them spoke German, I think. And, yeah.
The other question I had is, you're mentioning that he was more liberal in his interpretation of, say, the organ and the way the organ should be played. Did he come under criticism from the conservative? I don't know the politics very well, but I could imagine a German-dominated instrument like that, he might have been very heavily criticized and maybe even ostracized for that. So were there schools of the Leonhardt students versus all the other ones?
Well, not many people studied organ with him because he wasn't officially an organ teacher, and not many of them thought to ask, can I have organ lessons? And but as a performer and things, he was kind of out on a limb, doing something that other people we're not doing. Some of the things that he did in terms of what we can learn about fingerings from historic sources. He was one of the pioneers. He wasn't the only pioneer to look at historic fingerings, but that has now become much more mainstream in the organ world. Certainly in Holland and but in other countries, certainly in the United States as well. I think organists learn what historic fingerings are and what that means for articulation, what it can mean, what the possibilities are. But he was definitely way ahead of other people. And yeah, he was, I think in the organ world in Holland, he was very respected because he really campaigned for the restoration of historic instruments. And he was on endless committees, and he was always being consulted for advice, and other organists respected him for the work that he put into that. But as a player, they were like, oh, he kind of does things a bit strange, doesn't he?
What did he think about the popularization of early music and his role in helping to bring that about?
Yeah.
It seems like he might have been of two minds about.
Yeah, definitely. On the one hand, he was always interested in meeting people that had the same interests that he had. So he had this very formal, aristocratic sort of manner, and a lot of people were a bit scared just to talk to him and things like that. But he actually really welcomed that, and he would invite all kinds of people to the house to talk to them, to play his instruments and stuff like that, even if they weren't his students. So, when you're doing something which has very few people interested, then you're quite excited when you meet someone who is a kindred spirit. Of course, early music did get very commercialized, and he was a bit of a snob, and he sometimes thought that certain performers who were on television too much, and he hated television. He also hated the internet. He would rather accept an invitation to play in some village in Holland that had this beautiful small organ and that paid, peanuts to go play there, than, to play in some massive concert hall where you could hardly even hear the harpsichord. He wouldn't play the harpsichord with amplification stuff. So, yeah, and he hated pop music, with a passion. So if you went into a restaurant with him and they, would just have the radio on or something like that, he would go up to them and say, "Can you turn it off?" And if they said no, he would sometimes just leave, But if there was another place to go eat.
Really curious. What made him laugh?
What made him laugh?
What made him laugh?
He actually had a really good sense of humor, and
Music,
outside of music, he had some unusual interests. I think he loved James Bond because it was so over the top and ridiculous and everything. He loved, for this person, it's like, oh, all our technology is much better from the 18th century. He loved fast cars. He had an Alfa Romeo. It was sometimes hard to figure out what he thought would be a funny joke, and sometimes I failed to do that things. He once said to me, "Oh, if we're trying to understand why Bach did it in this way, Bach was a genius, and we aren't. And we can never understand the mind of a genius." Well, to me, I think Leonhardt was a genius, not on the level of Bach, I know, but in his own way, he was a genius. And I could never really understand a lot about what made him tick and things. But, we did become friends. I stayed in contact with him right up until his death, and I could always call and go visit and write letters and stuff like that. He visited me where I lived in London and stuff. So, he would warm to you, but you had to kind of find your way into it. And if you chose the wrong path, then it would just fall completely flat, and he would just be quite distant. So that was a little difficult. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Please go to our website. Please go to our website and see the archive. If you just Google Leonhardt Archive, it's the only Leonhardt archive, and you can read it. Thank you very much.